Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to International House, and welcome to the second annual CEGU conference, Past and Future Commons. My name is Michael Colma, and I'm the head of programs and communications here at International House. Today's program is part of our Global Voices lecture series programming. From the day International House opened its doors over 91 years ago, we've been dedicated to the promotion of understanding and fellowship among the people of all nations. We're focused on promoting cross-cultural understanding, mutual respect, and friendship among international students, scholars, and the community. That mission is made manifest through programs like tonight's, and in collaboration with many partners, and that mission guides the work of the 15 other international houses around the world as well. I invite you to explore more of our upcoming programs on our website and via social media to stay engaged about our diverse range of events. Before we delve into the important topic that will take place over the course of the next 2 days, a few thank yous. I want to thank the iHouse team who helped us to put together the conference, working together with CEGU, and that's, of course, a good segue into thanking, of course, our partners at CEGU, in particular, Frederick, Sabina, Carlo, and Danielle. Also want to thank, of course, all the speakers that you'll be seeing over the course of tonight and over the course of all day tomorrow. In particularly, and for tonight's main speaker, thank you to Jake Bittle. As we gather here today, the global challenges on climate change and biodiversity loss are very front and center topics. I've been involved with some work over the last couple of years that delves deeply into our collective interdependence, a topic that regularly refers to the commons. So I'm excited to hear what the speakers will say over the course of the next 2 days. Now, for further remarks and to really get us started on this journey, I'd like to introduce Sabina Shaikh. Sabina wears many hats at the university, and I'll just mention a couple of them and then turn the podium over. Sabina is a senior instructional professor at CEGU in the college. She's the faculty director of Chicago Studies, and she's the faculty co-lead of the Environmental Frontiers Initiative at the Mansueto Institute. Please join me in welcoming Sabina. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael, and thank you to iHouse for co-sponsoring and hosting us here tonight. I didn't know you were going to introduce me, so thank you very much. That was very nice of you. So welcome, everybody, and welcome to everyone who's come from out of town and to everybody who's here on campus. We're really excited about tonight's talk and kicking off the second annual CEGU conference. This year's title is Past and Future Commons. We're really excited about tonight's talk and tomorrow's discussions. You'll hear more about the topic, more about the theme, and all of that tomorrow. I just wanted to, by way of introduction, let you know about a couple of people who were very instrumental in making this all happen. So the CEGU conference is supported by this year's organizers, who are all here. I don't know where everyone's sitting, but Ali Cusson, Nicole Whalen, and CEGU interim chair, Friedrich Albert Janssen. And I also wanted to thank our amazing staff, Carlo, Danielle, and Tess, who are all here with us as well. I wanted to give a special thank you and shout out to the Hedeker family. Ben Hedeker is here with us tonight, and you'll be hearing a lot more from him tomorrow. We wanted to thank you and your family for the support of the CEGU conference and lectures, as well as the CEGU undergraduate and graduate student research grants. Many of our grantees are here tonight and will be here tomorrow, and I'm sure they'd love to tell you about their research, and we are most grateful to be able to support and expand that important student research, as well as bring the eminent scholars and voices to campus that are all here for our conference. So thank you to you, and we'll hear more from Ben and from Friedrich tomorrow in the opening remarks. This year, we're particularly excited to bring into the conference the long-standing Frizzell Speaker and Learning Series keynote address, with generous support from the Frizzell family, who are here with us today. Thank you in the front row. The Frizzell series commemorates the life, accomplishments, and aspirations of Alexander Frizzell, who was a student here in the college. It is led by students and faculty who share interests with Alex, including social and health advocacy, environment, and agriculture. Throughout the year, we've had several Frizzell Series events, including the Weather Report, which is a series of teach-ins on climate change led by my colleagues in CEGU, Alexander Arroyo and Mary Beth Putup, who is here in the front row, and an alumni event that was organized by our students, Ava Hedeker, Emma Sue, Jonathan Garcia, and Sophia Johansson. I think Ava and, well, I know Ava's here, and Jonathan is here as well tonight. So I'd like to thank the Frizzell family who, for the continued generosity and ongoing support of this series and events, as well as for coming every year to these events. So thank you. We're thrilled about tonight's alumni speaker, who already had a compelling and robust discussion with students earlier today. Just quickly, after his talk, we'll have time for a Q&A, and we'll go right into Q&A. We'll have some microphones to pass around, and then we invite you all to stay for the reception, as well as, of course, join us for all of the programming tomorrow. As is convention, we invite a student from the Frizzell Organizing Committee to give the introduction of our speaker. So I will introduce the student, and she will introduce the speaker. Ava Hedeker Ava's back here. She's a third-year student double majoring in CEGU and inquiry and research in the humanities. She grew up in Chicago and is interested in how the city can promote environmental justice through improving access to public transit and green space. On campus, she is a part of the Phoenix Sustainability Initiative and a researcher for a century on 63rd Street. This was the bio she gave me. I know she's involved in about 10 other organizations, as well as been working with me as a research assistant for the past 2 years. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ava, who will then introduce you to Jake.
Thank you all for coming. As part of our annual Frizzell Family Learning and Speaker Series, I am pleased to introduce you to Whose Land Is It to Lose? Climate Change, Managed Retreat, and the Commons, a talk facilitated by Jake Bittle. Jake is a UChicago alum and is now a reporter who covers climate change, energy, and housing, among other topics. Previously a writer for the Chicago Maroon and the South Side Weekly, he is now a staff writer at Grits. His work has also appeared in the New York Times, Guardian, Harper's Magazine, and other publications. Recently, he wrote the book, The Great Displacement. Through gripping personal narratives, he vividly portrays how U.S. citizens are already experiencing the severe consequences of climate disasters firsthand. Thank you, Jake, for joining us.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, thank you guys for having me. Thank you to the Frizzell family. This is exciting. As Ava mentioned, I'm not an academic. None of my work has ever been peer reviewed. For the most part, most of my work is about listening to individual people's stories and figuring out the processes that they're impacted by. And that often brings up big questions that academics discuss at the conferences like these. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, help, maybe you can help me answer some of these questions. Today I'm going to share with you a kind of like a fable about environmental destruction and forced displacement and cultural loss, sort of about competing efforts to claim land for communal or private usage. Before I do that, though, I think I'd be remiss not to note that the largest instance of forced displacement and cultural loss extant today in the world is the result of Israel's campaign in Gaza. I just want to express my support for the students of the University of Chicago and their encampment, and my disappointment with the university for sowing the wind of open discourse and not being willing to reap the whirlwind of tents. So thank you for that. Okay, so it's good to be back here in Chicago, though, and it's fitting because, from one point of view at least, this story begins in Chicago. I assume some of you have read Nature's Metropolis by William Cronin. You probably remember that the making of Chicago, at least at the beginning, was the Illinois-Michigan Canal, which connected the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River Basin. And part of the point of this was, some private investors got together and they really wanted to be able to move freight from New York to the Mississippi River, so they built this. But the problem was that the Mississippi River was big and muddy and it was really hard to navigate. So eventually, Congress deputized the Army Corps of Engineers to build a system of levees and spillways along the lower Mississippi River, which sort of allowed ships to go up and down with more ease. This was very difficult. There was a philosophical conflict about whether it's better to build walls along the river in the form of levees or create spillways for the water to go through. But they did quite a bit of it. And eventually, in 1926, this guy, the chief of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, said, okay, I think it's good. We're providing a safe and adequate channel for navigation, and we're going to prevent floods. So this was a very, very, very ill-timed quotation, because the next spring, probably the largest and most damaging flood in the history of the United States happened on the Mississippi River. It completely destroyed the Corps' levee system. And the water all went downstream, and then the bankers in New Orleans were really afraid there's going to be a run on the banks. So they blew up a portion of the levee at Carnarvon. I think it was either Coolidge or Herbert Hoover who approved this, and flooded like an entire town in the lower Mississippi River. Actually, maybe more than a town, a lot of people. So having seen the levee's only approach fail, the Corps' decision was actually to double down on it. They built a lot more levees, and the result of leveeing the entire Mississippi River was that a lot of the sediment that came down the Mississippi no longer was reaching the basin and no longer filling out the land. So Louisiana used to look like this. It's a bad map, of course, but the point is there was a lot of land. And that was the result of the Mississippi it moved a lot as time went on, and it would deposit land in a bunch of different places. But once they leveed the river, this wasn't happening anymore. So you guys probably all know what happened next. Well, hold on, I'm going to tell you about something else first. So this landscape, this sedimentary landscape, allowed for the maintenance of a really unique culture. This is the Pointe-au-Chien Indian tribe. They were descendants of the Biloxi, Chitimacha, and Choctaw. They had been sort of forced out of the eastern United States by the Indian Removal Act. And they ended up on land that really hadn't been inhabited much before the 1700s. And they were able to make a really, really good life on this land, actually. No one was really bothering them. They could raise cattle, they could shrimp, they could grow a lot of plants. You can see this is like really thick ground. They thatched these huts. They were entirely self-sufficient. They didn't have a cash economy until the 20th century. So this was they depended for this, though, on the sediment that was sustaining the land from the Mississippi. As I was saying, okay, so yeah, this is everything I just said. This is from the book. They weaved, baskets and did some ritual stuff and grew fruit and vegetables with this stuff that they were growing on this really, really solid land. That's a list of really tasty vegetables that they were able to grow. Okay, so then once the sediment disappeared, and you guys probably know this already, it's like a football field of land lost in Louisiana every minute. And this is the direct result, at least at the beginning, of the Corps of Engineers leveeing the Mississippi River, again, so that marine freight could be transported more efficiently. All this land was lost really, really fast. And this wasn't the only reason. So the shallow Gulf of Mexico, as you guys all probably also know, there's a lot of oil there. So the land that was the tribes, right, it was informally theirs. They had lived there for generations and no one had touched it. It got divvied up and carved up by these oil companies who really wanted the oil. So this is all good land. It wasn't eroding. Those are roads, basically, that the companies were digging through. So I found this kind of amazing title map. George Ellender was he was the heir of a kind of property family, well-property family there. There were a lot of Native Americans living on his land. He actually lived in New Orleans. And he deeded over this land to the Louisiana Land and Exploration Company. This used to be called Delaware Fur Trapping Company. It was like they leased land to fur trappers. They rebranded when oil was found, and then later they became part of ConocoPhillips, which is a big oil major. They did the Willow Project. So that on the top right is a map of pipelines in Louisiana, and that, of course, is oil wells. So this all happened really fast. Now, dredging and carving up that land intensified the process of erosion because it gave the water a place to go. And then, of course, it also led to stuff like this. That's from Deepwater Horizon. Rather dramatic picture. Okay, so what did the tribe do, though? They resisted this pretty intensely. You don't have to read all that, but basically, I talked to the family of this guy, Sidney Verdun, who he sort of waged like a guerrilla campaign against the oil companies. He would like destroy their signs or like cut up their pipelines, and like they were really upset. They hired policemen basically to bother him, and he bothered them back. They couldn't never spell his name right, which I always thought was funny. Like there's like 10 different versions of it, and they never seem to get it right. It's a relatively simple name. Anyway, and then, of course, he also sued them for trespassing on his land. No one could decide whose land this really was. So the other thing, of course, is that the Earth was warming, which causes the seas to expand, and this is the relative sea level at Grand Isle. near Sydney Verdun's land. It was going up quite a bit. This is independent of the oil companies and the levee on the Mississippi River, which is going up. So all of this together means there was not a lot of land left. That same picture, which showed like relatively robust land and the thatched huts, it became this eventually. All those trees are dead because of saltwater intrusion. That marsh grass is like the only thing that can still grow. Okay, so we have this problem in Louisiana now, in the late 1900s. A lot of land's disappearing. It's sort of threatening inland communities in addition to the Pointe-Noire tribe. What are we going to do about it? I'm sure they could come up with some good ideas. So this was one of them. This is this is like for connoisseurs of this kind of thing. This is like a favorite one. People love this one because it's elevated 18 feet in the air in order to comply with flood insurance requirements. The amazing thing about this is actually water came in here. This family, I met them, and they can't elevate it anymore because if it were elevated more, it would be too high and the wind from the hurricanes would knock it over. So they're not in a good place. So that's one way. You can seed the low part of the ground to the water and then have your house up there. Another possibility is you could build these locks. This is not a very good picture of it, but basically what they do is they defend the land that's inland. You close them up during storm events to prevent the erosion out there, and you basically give up everything that's outside of them. So I talked about this in the student lunch earlier today. This is the Mr. Go, the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet Canal. After Katrina, this was like an economic benefit project that the Corps did. They carved a big canal so that ships could go up and down and bring benzene and all that. Eventually, a hurricane came and filled it up and flooded New Orleans. That was one of the reasons that Katrina was so bad. So what they do, they decided, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. We're going to cede this land back to nature. We're going to fill up Mr. Go. Okay, so this is their other big project. This is the last one, I promise. It's called the Morganza the Gulf Levee System. It's sort of like a Rubicon for sea level rise. Basically, they built a giant levee where that red line is, and they basically said, everything outside of this, we're not going to have any business defending, okay? You might not be able to get flood insurance there. We're not going to build levee projects there. This is what we're keeping, and we're going to get rid of all the other stuff. So guess who was on the other side? A lot of people who had no other options. So this is the Pointe-Noire school. Most classmates are the Pointe-Noire Indian tribe, and over time, right, all the shrimpers, the sort of marsh boat guys, they couldn't make a living out there anymore because all their land was gone, right? The shrimp and oysters, they needed a certain balance of salinity in order to populate. All those guys were gone, so they moved away. The school ran out of students, basically. This was like the only students left, and so the state closed it, or actually it was the parish that closed it. So this was like a process of depopulation, and they fought really, really hard to save it. Then what happened? It actually got destroyed in a hurricane a couple of years later. This was in 2021 as a result of Hurricane Ida. There was no more marshland barrier to protect the school anymore. It used to slow down the hurricanes as they'd come up, but it wasn't there anymore. Okay, so this is Ile-de-Jean-Charles. This is a quite famous case. It was profiled in the New York Times, the New Yorker. This is an island. It's right near Pointe-Noire. It lost 98% of its landmass, and it was outside that Morganza, the Gulf levee system, right? So they were not going to do anything to protect it. So what they did instead, excuse me, I'm on the next page now. What they did instead was the Obama administration gave them some money to relocate the remaining residents. There were probably 48 that took the money. They said, okay, well, why don't you come to a new community that we'll build inside the levee system? And this is the first, sort of notable because it was the first time that the state, defined broadly, had ever recognized the right to like the continuance of community, right? It's not just we're gonna move the householder, it's we're gonna move the entire community and try to preserve that community. It was like, this is like big news in 2016, 2017. But I've been down there a couple of times. It didn't really work out very well. This is what they built, and like it looks nice, right? But the problem is this is a fishing community, right? So they built in this like pond, kind of looks like a river. Not that they fished on a river anyway. But the state kind of cheaped out, right? You can't fish in that. There's no fish in it. And those homes are fine, right? But like they're in the middle of nowhere. There's like no Walmart, and you can't see it. But there's like a Chevron facility, like right here. So no one was happy about that because Chevron like owned most of the pipelines. So this is very, very controversial because like the initiative was really good and the idea for it actually came from the tribe, but the execution was just awful. The other problem was that they actually sold the land to a company. This isn't DuPont, like DuPont. It's not that DuPont. It's another guy named DuPont. The real DuPont probably would have been even more aggressive, but they were going to create like a like a fishing camp basically out here, and the tribe got really mad. No one had any clue what to do with this land. I mean, this is some of the first land in the US that had been actively consigned by the state to nature, but you could still do stuff on it, right? It wasn't gone yet. So the question is like, what should we do with it? And this was one answer that the state was gonna have, and they actually, I think they canceled this. Yeah, everyone got too mad at them. But just, there was like a really deep, sort of profound question about, okay, well, who decides it's time to go? And then what do you do with the land, right? Is it just nature now? Like, how do you decide, where's the dividing line there? Okay, there's some other examples. This is in Houston. This is after Hurricane Harvey. The problem was, this is actually also the Army Corps of Engineers' fault. You'll be surprised to learn. They built these 2 flood reservoirs, basically just giant bowls to catch water during hurricanes. But they knew that a 100-year flood, so to speak, would actually overcome the bowl and flood like thousands of homes. They decided not to buy the land. They let developers develop on that land. So these are all homes that were technically in the Army Corps of Engineers flood pool for the Addicks and Barker reservoirs, which means it actually was legally considered a takings. Like the government now, they basically took an involuntary easement when Hurricane Harvey happened, and now they technically have the easement to every home. People still live in those, but actually technically the Corps owns their property because they could flood it again at any time and wouldn't have to pay damages. So again, the question of like, what land do we consign to nature? What land do we want to keep and try to own water as well? Try to keep and cultivate for economic use or for human use. They answered it badly there. So in Houston, what they also did was they bought out a bunch of neighborhoods, right? These are my pictures. So they bought out thousands of homes that were too flood prone, and they said, okay, let's just get rid of these subdivisions. You know, we'll just move the homeowners away. But amazingly, though, they mowed the lawn. I mean, the county mows the lawn, and there's actually, you can't see, there's a Frisbee golf course on this neighborhood. And it's amazing. It takes them forever to convince everyone to leave, first of all, because people say, well, I'm the only one left. I got a huge yard now. But then once they do, they don't know what to do with it. There's no plan, right? So it's, again, like, what do you do with that land once it's gone? Okay, this is the Florida Keys. Same thing. You know, the government in the United States has an affirmative duty to maintain roads, right? We need roads to do commerce and live on. These roads, they're flooded for like 3 months out of the year now. Like, they're almost always flooded in the fall. So the Keys said, like, we can't afford to raise all these roads. First of all, then you got to raise the houses. But also, like, there's no money, right? Even the Biden administration gave a lot of money for this. There's nowhere near enough money even to just do it in the Keys, right? So they said, we're not going to do it. But can you do that, right, as the government? What does it mean? Is it a condemnation? Is it a taking? Is it an easement? I'm not a lawyer, but it's a really hard question, right? Like, can the government just abandon land, abandon roads? It's a public right-of-way. Okay, and then you guys maybe saw this video. So there's a bunch of houses on the Outer Banks that are underwater most of the time. At high tide, they're literally underwater. They're on stilts. The stilts are underwater. The houses are underwater. And they're always getting knocked into the ocean on bad days. But people who don't live in them, because you can't, right, because you need a boat to get out of the house, they still want to rebuild them over and over again for some reason, because they think maybe the government's going to come put in more sand. So there's all this litigation about, okay, the government, the National Park Service, which technically owns the beachfront once it becomes beachfront, or the county, will say, like, all right, well, we're not going to do it. We're condemning this home. And the person who lives in, like, New Jersey, it will sue and say, okay, like, I'm not going to let you do this, but why do they want it? No one knows. And also, oh, hold on, let me go back. The Pacific Legal Foundation, a conservative legal institute, helps them with this kind of amazingly. It's like a property rights thing, right? So they do this individual liberty takings lawsuit stuff for people who, like, they don't live in the home, no one's gonna rent the home, it's just there, but at what point is it not private property anymore? At what point does it become nature, right? So this, in my mind, raises at least 3 really, really difficult questions, and I'd love to hear you guys help me answer them, no pressure. Okay, so at what point does private property cease to be private? At what point does it become the commons, if you will, or just nature? Who gets to decide when that happens? Is it the state? Is it the community? Is it the householder? Right? And when it's ambiguous, as it seems almost always to be, like, who's the final word, right? Or, you know, even if it's public property, right, like a road or something, who gets to decide, okay, we're not going to maintain this anymore, it's part of nature now, okay? So then, when you get displaced, and in this case, like the Pointe-Nochon tribe, they weren't just displaced by nature, right? They were displaced by the Corps of Engineers, they were displaced by ConocoPhillips, they were displaced by every other oil company that burned fossil fuels and caused the seas. Okay, like, what does the state owe them, right? Like, what happens, right? How do we redress, how do you quantify that loss, first of all? Is it just the loss of the home value? Is it the loss of some kind of, I'm trying to put a dollar on community? And does the state have an affirmative guarantee, okay, to make sure that they get their community or get all the intangibles, the cultural life that was threatened by the levies and the oil companies, et cetera? And so is that even possible to guarantee? Like they tried it in Ile de Jean Charles. It didn't really work out too well. They tried to say, okay, we're gonna move you, you're gonna keep your community, but nobody seems to think that happened. Okay, so how can they compensate them? And then the third one, right, like, we know who's responsible for this, right? Like there's a pretty, coherent set of the US government, ConocoPhillips, Exxon, Louisiana Land, everyone, okay? We know, so how do we respond as responsibility, which also involves the process of quantification, right? So you can think of this in terms of damages, right? Or justice in this case always comes down to damages. What was lost and how do you redress it? So this is a very, very, very difficult and painful question, Like, what, is there any possible way to extort or, expropriate rather the companies and make redress to the families that have now been scattered to like Mississippi and Ohio, and they're working on benzene boats and stuff. They don't want to be doing this. They want to be shrimping, but they can't anymore because of the manipulation of the river for freight, et cetera. So climate change and environmental degradation, including the effort to claim land for economic development, end up forcing the transition of other land from private property into nature. And so what do we do about that, and how do we make that right, or can we? So that's it. These are some nice photos of Pointe-Nochon. So that's all. If you can, thank you. Yes. Oh, well, so what are we doing again? We're gonna do, sorry, we're gonna do questions. And I maybe will be able to hear you because there's not that many people here. So maybe, oh, there's a microphone, but you can go ahead if you want to not wait for the microphone. Oh, use the microphone because it's being recorded. I forgot. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Jake. I have two things I want to say. One, I didn't say at lunch, which is your book is very beautifully written.
Thank you so much.
And I want to recommend it to everyone who's here.
The English department.
But really, hats off to you. I mean, I started reading it, and it became like I couldn't put it down. It's beautiful. So the question, I mean, I want to ask a specific question about this community that was moved.
Yeah.
And you said, well, it was a failure. I mean, okay, there were, like, could you talk about what that meant from the position of the community? Like, who says it's a failure?
Right.
Did they say, what did they say? I'm just curious about
Right.
that. And I'm wondering to what extent this whole question of moving communities assumes that there's, like, more integrity, like that there's there's a community there that
Right.
is maybe all in agreement. You
Yeah.
know, how much that carries over.
Yeah. So it's very, very, very messy. So none of the tribes, there's multiple, have federal recognition. So they don't have reservation rights or trust rights, right? So this is basically just, it's advocacy on the part of state-recognized tribes who don't have any legal rights. And so there was a lot of disagreement. A lot of people didn't take the money. There's like 5 or 6 families that are still there on the island, and they'll probably be there until their homes are washed away. They just don't want to leave because they think that this is the place that they have connection to and they don't want to give it up. The failure of it in the eyes of the community was basically they came to the state and said, this is our plan. If we, one group, right, like representing the majority of residents and enrolled members of the tribe said, we'd like to move. This is our vision for what a new community could look like. Can you go try to get the money? And the state, to their credit, I think, they tried to go get them. They got the first ever grant program that was ever, and this is one of the only ones that's ever been done for this. And they said, okay, but it wasn't enough money, and the state kind of, they reneged on their promise to build like what they had said to the community. They said, okay, it's gonna be, we're gonna have vernacular architecture, right? There's gonna be a deep connection to water. There's gonna be an economic development corridor so you guys can have businesses. They really just got like D.R. Horton to build like 48 homes on a piece of vacant land, which is like, from one perspective, great because those homes are way safer, although they're still well within the range of what a Category 5 hurricane could take out, and almost did. But from the perspective of many of the tribe members, this just wasn't enough, right? And it also wasn't what they, I mean, try as I might, I can't get the communications between them, although like BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, really should give them to me, but they won't. But so I don't really know what was said, but they claim that they made an agreement. It basically wasn't honored, right? But it wasn't contractual. It was like informal, yeah. Yeah.
Hi. Given the length of time that some of these communities have been there, like the Isle de Jean Charles, is there any right of return that being considered?
Yeah, I mean, so the proposal is that the island, the people who were enrolled in the tribe or have proven residence should get like some kind of decision they should be able to make some kind of decision about what the future use of the land is until it's unusable. So probably what it will be is it'll be like public land, but with a provision that they could, go fish on it. They would get like, and also they were very adamant that it shouldn't be developed. So that's kind of, and so like they can't, I don't think that they have a right to go buy property there again. Because from the state's point of view, this is about reducing risk, right? So they won't want everyone to like move back. But it can't be developed, and the tribe has like some kind of informal guarantee that they could, use it for recreational and cultural use, and it probably never will be developed. So that's kind of the closest thing. But in every other case where there's been like home buyouts or managed retreat, there's no like remnant right of property. It's like all gone. So yeah.
Thanks for this talk. So many of the aspects of forcible displacement that you're discussing here have clear resonances in the longer colonial history of forcible displacement that you mentioned. And it leads me to wonder, one, to what extent is the relationship between colonialism and climate change at the forefront for the people you're actually talking to? Like, is that a present consideration for them? And then two, more conceptually, how do these issues around private property, expropriation, the government's role, et cetera, change if we think about this in the framework of a history of settler colonialism?
Yeah,
Thanks.
yeah. I mean, the second part of it is really profound and tough, right? Like, in theory, redress for this might involve looking outside of the system of private property that was like imposed by when you're talking about indigenous communities, right, would involve looking outside of that system, right? Like, and that's why a lot of the tribes, like this tribe, they're seeking, and they're not likely to get, recognition from the federal government as a federally recognized tribe, which would mean that they have trust rights, right? Which it's still a Western system, but it would allow them they'd be like a self-governing, nation, really. Anyway, the first part, it really depends on the person in this case. Like, some people are very eloquent about the relationship between like the imposition of settlement on these lands that they were just left alone, right? Like, it's interesting, like they were only there because of the Indian Removal Act, right? But they obviously became very attached to this land. And it was deemed worthless, right, when they got there. Like, just no one really wanted to go there. You also just like couldn't. It was really hard to get there from New Orleans because it's really like dense. But like they now will talk about it in terms of like, okay, like then white people came in, right, they wanted oil, they wanted to trap nutria or whatever. But then others, not so much, right? They just think of it as like they got screwed over by their neighbor, who happens to be ConocoPhillips. So it's a good question though. I mean, in Alaska, like where they've also done a lot of this, I think there's probably more, because those Alaskan, like the Indian villages in Alaska they were put together much more recently as a result of a federal initiative to like stop people from being nomadic for whatever reason. And so there's a lot more like consciousness there because the history is so recent of like we were put in these villages and then they're eroding and now they want to move us away. So yeah, I think that, depends, but yeah. In the front and then the back.
Hey,
Hey.
In the book, you talk a lot about insurance.
Oh, yeah.
Especially if I'm remembering in the California fire kind of chapter. There's a fire part of the book too. If you're not a floods kind of person, there's a bunch of fire in the book too. But anyway, like insurance comes across as being part of the problem. I think justifiably, but insurance is kind of like fundamentally sort of a socialization of risk. We don't usually think about it like that, but that is it's sort of a commoning in a sense. So I'm just wondering whether you like is there a way that insurance or some kind of conception of insurance could be part of a solution rather than part of the problem as it has been?
Yeah, so I mean, like you really wouldn't think it, but like one of the main like solutions that's proposed, this is getting way far afield from Louisiana, but when you talk about climate adaptation at the global level, like, basically reparations made from developed countries to developing countries, one of the main tools, especially when it comes to drought and flooding, is insurance, right? They basically create parametric programs that if you get flooded, you immediately get like $500, right? Or if there's a certain bad rainy season, your crop's gonna fail, they'll give you 500 and also some tools to like some substitute food or some stuff so you could grow some different crops. So you have to pay into those programs, like that's the nature of insurance, but the payments are de minimis and they're subsidized by like the World Bank or something. So but it's so much cheaper than, even with those de minimis payments, it's so much cheaper than just giving everyone and it's also more sustainable. It doesn't require like the continued, they can self-finance at a certain point if there's no bad year. So yeah, I mean, now some people would say and do, like, that's still not great if like a pastoralist has to like pay $5 to be in this program, like maybe he doesn't have $5. But like those pooling of risk systems, especially when they're what's called parametric, like they trigger when something happens, not when a certain damage, like when a certain claim has been reached. Those are considered to be a huge part of like the global, fixing like what they call like the adaptation gap. Like there just being like so little movement on that. Yeah, that's one potential example. Yeah, there was someone in the back.
Thanks for being here and doing
no
this
problem.
talk. I think my question is about the political power that they don't wield and the lobbying power of the corporations that are, pushing them out and causing the climate change, especially in these red states that, climate change isn't real to them. How are we supposed to get through that, like the politicalization of it all? The reality is here, but no one's actually admitting it. Yeah, really good question. And Louisiana is an interesting case, as is Florida now, because from one point of view, like a certain degree of, there's actually bipartisan support to the extent that there's two parties. There's bipartisan support for what we would call like climate adaptation. Like nobody in Louisiana is mad when they do a shoreline restoration or when we do levees. We don't call it climate adaptation, right? And even this kind of stuff like enjoys relatively broad support and people don't mind spending money on it, right? So that's one point. But the root causes, right, which is like oil and gas, climate change, fossil fuels, nobody there has any appetite to move on that, of course. Now, the interesting point, though, is like those problems are generated at the global level, at least. So if Louisiana doesn't do much to act on climate change, but California and New York and Ohio and Illinois, whatever, do, it brings down the global emissions burden and probably reduces the future burden on these. It's too late for them, but for other communities like that, right? So a community, like a state, can be really recalcitrant on climate change, but in a certain sense, like the fate of climate impacts is like not really dependent on what they choose to do. But when you come to disputes like this, which is like between a state-recognized tribe with like next to no political power, and then also it's very small. There's like 80 enrolled members, and versus like Conoco, like there's just no way, right? And that's just like, it's just really hard to figure out how to address that because this is a very small constituency, and the constituency, even in this parish of people who benefit from oil and gas, is tremendous. Like it's in the tens of thousands of people who work for that industry, and many of the tribe members actually also do. So that's hard, but it's a really good question.
yourself and then.
Okay. Does this work? Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Jake. This
course.
is fascinating. I want to reframe your topic a little bit by asking about biodiversity. Mike Hume, the geographer, warns us not to fall victim to climate reductionism, seeing the planetary emergencies solely as a function of carbon, disrupted carbon. So that leads me to a more sort of concrete set of questions. Are there signs of ecological restoration, spontaneous, rise of biodiversity in places that have been abandoned? And how do we think about that in relation with the more anthropocentric story you're telling of justice, of land use?
Yeah.
I mean, can we reimagine land that has been formally abandoned, has been removed from a liberal private property regime, but now is actually perhaps increasing in value in its ecological use?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And like you could imagine a world in which, now I don't think it's going to happen here because they just really did a number on this, the oil companies did. Like it's just, there's dozens of pipelines that have been abandoned, they're not even in use anymore. It's hard to, now, eventually, like the landscape will change, but the dominant influence, right, is the saltwater intrusion. So you're probably not likely to see any recovery there because it's just going to be consumed over time. However, you could imagine a situation where, and this happened in Houston, for instance, like they abandoned a lot of land. That land's not doomed, it's just very flood prone. So if it becomes part of the river, it will get restored. And you could imagine a situation in which like the government decides to like sell this as like ecosystem services, right? Like this is like a big buzzword now in like the climate biodiversity space. Like, can we get the private sector involved in like recognizing the value of untouched nature or untouched nature? And so yeah, like that could totally happen. It hasn't happened yet. And like I said, they were still mowing the lawn. That's Bermuda grass, right? Like that's the worst plant. Yeah, and they just, I think they just think that people want that, right? But yeah, that could totally happen, and I think like it's a really difficult topic, and it comes up a lot. We were talking about it earlier today, like the conflict between biodiversity, like endangered species preservation, et cetera, and like climate action, and sometimes those are in direct conflict, like with renewable power development. Other times, they're just moving on different tracks, like the Montreal Protocol on biodiversity, or maybe it was the Kunming-Montreal Global they were going to have it in Kunming, but they had to cancel it because of COVID today in Montreal. So it's the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. Like that was agreed in like 2 years. The world's countries came together behind that agreement, and they're on like COP 29 now, and they just barely in 28 at Abu Dhabi got the idea of like, or Dubai, excuse me, like, okay, let's transition away from fossil fuels. So at once there's more agreement on that, but also it's very hard, it's very difficult to do, to reach those like restoration goals. And we'll have to see, whether they can. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious about your question about litigation as a means of helping these victims of environmental change. And I know that you wrote a really good article about wildfire litigation and how in the Pacific Northwest there are these wildfires that are caused by utility companies. But then there are a lot of challenges that come with that because, it's like people need these utility companies, and when they're sued, they can pass off the cost to the people who are, paying their utility bills, and that rise in rates can then in turn affect the people who are affected by the wildfires. And I guess I'm curious, like in this context, what do you see as some of the pitfalls or potential benefits of environmental litigation, and are there any better paths forward?
Yeah, this is a really good question because you have to imagine, like, what if one of these cases, like the Hawaii case or the Massachusetts AG has a good one, what if they were to succeed, right? And it's like, was it Montana kids sued? Maybe it was Idaho? God, I really should know that. Montana, thank you. Anyway, like, what happens if they win and they're forced to pay damages? Like, then what happens? Could the state have to pay damages? What about the oil companies? And I think that those are like, they're kind of throwing spaghetti with those. Like, there's hundreds of them, right? And one of them will work one day, and we'll find out like what the impact is if a company or a state like has to make over a bunch of money or changes policies. I think in those cases, like, you kind of have to do that because the rest of the policy landscape is not going very fast, to say the least, on climate change. But then, you know, like you bring up a good counterexample with the XL and PG&E lawsuits, because and this is true with insurance as well, like fixing the problem, it involves like spending, right? And in order to spend, or like both justice, right, and also solution to the problem would involve like capital investment on the part of PG&E. And it's in raising that money, like it's hard to do. And that money eventually, in the case of insurance, if the insurance market goes bust, that's gonna come from the taxpayers. And they may not be incurring the same risk, right? So like, should a person who lives in like LA, you know, along the Los Angeles River in a third-story apartment, they're never gonna have a fire consume their, knock on wood, they're never gonna, should they be financing the risk of like some guy who lives in the Sierra Nevada in like $1 million home? Or I guess like a $5 million home, because every home is $1 million in California. It's a tough one, right? It's really, really hard. And I think like there's an urgency in the spending need. So those maybe on net are good, and especially in states where the tax base can absorb it, but it's really hard. PG&E, by the way, they solved this problem because they sold their power plant unit to Apollo. So they they raised some money without having to go to the ratepayers. Finally, yeah. Oh, over there.
Hi, yeah, thank you for doing this talk. I kind of have, already my own opinions on this question I'm about to ask, but I just want to hear your take. I guess, like, with the questions about, you know, like, who gets to decide, like, what we, like, do about these things. I feel like the notion of, like, private property, like, kind of presupposes that, like, it's your right to choose what to do with the land. And so I was wondering if you think that, like, private, like, ownership of land in these areas can, like, exist alongside imagining, like, new uses of this land in a more sustainable future, and, like, if so, how, and if not, why not?
Right, yeah. So, like, let's say that a city uses eminent domain to get the last guy in a coastal home that's eroding, like, off of his land, which they have done, right? So I think a lot of times, like, our response to that situation, it depends on who the guy is, right? Like, in this case, if they had used eminent domain instead of going to the Obama administration for money, like, this would have been, I mean, it's already really bad. This would have been a disaster. It would have been like a crime, basically, to do that. But when we're talking about like a second home on the Outer Banks, like, nobody, I mean, the Pacific Legal Foundation comes to their assistance, but like, I don't personally, like, my emotional response is not like, that's a crime. So I think you at some point have to make a value judgment about, like, the land tenure and the person, the use of the land, right? When you decide, like, to what extent should we respect the private property claim that is there, right? Instead of trying to overwhelm it. Now, when you're talking about, like, alternate, you know, arrangements for space land ownership, like, that is a really fertile area of, like, study and thought, but it's never really, to my knowledge, at least in the States, been tried. Like, it's either publicly owned, or it's surrendered, which is really hard, or it's, like, remains private, but it's useless, right? But if you could find a way around that, now sometimes they'll turn into a park, right? Like, that's one, but if you could find a way around that trinary, then there's some really interesting, you know, what about a communal, like, who knows, right? But it's never really been tried, I don't think. Yeah, but that's a good question.
So clearly there is a lot of failure when it comes to relocation, and in the case studies you've talked about, among others. And I'm sure that, especially in your interviews, there's a million causes for this, but as someone who tells these stories, do you see primary, I guess, limiting reagents? Like, is it a story about a lack of money, or just malicious neglect for impoverished communities? Is it a story about incompetence, lack of regulation? Like, if you could pull a few levers, which ones would you pull first?
I don't know. I mean, this is what's so fun, I don't want to say fun, what's so fun about working on this book is like every time you go there with a thought that it's one cause, it turns out that it's like 20. And people disagree about, like people will, and it becomes politicized, right? Like the conservative people, they usually thought like this is because the damn government built a channel behind my house and it's flooding. And then, the liberals said to me, like, it's because of climate change. And it's both. Like, but you can find neglect and incompetence and malice and just chance, honestly, in every single one of these cases. And like, I think that's kind of why we're here, is like, it's just like, you have to sit with that tension that like, you can't start, like why did I started the presentation in the Illinois-Michigan Canal? Because we're here in Chicago, but I could have started it at the Erie Canal, like New York, the Astors, right? The selling of the Manhattan Island, like anything could be like, and you just can't sort those out, in my opinion, or I'm not smart enough to anyway. Like, so that's what's fun about it for me, I think, is like you just can't, and you have to, and I left out a ton of stuff to save you guys, but yeah. Anyone else?
Questions? Okay, I was going to ask. Okay, so I'll take this chance to ask you a question, Jake. It's a question.
Oh, there was a fellow in the, well, you were kind of doing the.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. You go first.
Okay, thanks so much.
I could ask them later.
Okay. Thanks so much for this talk. It was really interesting. I would love to hear you say a bit more about, after your experience writing the book, what you see the role of the Army Corps of Engineers doing now. I mean, we often think that one of the problems of climate mitigation is we don't have either capital or enough technological know-how, capacity, or will to do some of the really ambitious projects that is required of the present, right? Yeah. But one would think that if you were to create an institution that would be responsible for doing that type of work, it would look a lot like the Army Corps of Engineers, right? I would just love to know sort of how you think about it, sort of what. I guess the kind of cynical question I have about them is like, what type of democratic mechanisms exist to sort of leverage their technical capacity to do the things that we actually need them to be doing?
Yeah. So this is an awesome question, and like the only, like one of the only bills that gets passed with like bipartisan basis every year is the Water Resources Development Act, as you probably know, which gives the Corps has more money than they can spend. Like they literally cannot spend the amount of money they have because they have too many steps before they spend. It's incredibly bureaucratic, and like interestingly, like it is such an inertia. There's just so much inertia in that organization. And there's actually a lot of people who work for it now who are like, what the hell? Like we could have gone into this, but their solution in Houston, Miami, Norfolk, Charleston, New York City is just build a wall. Like we're just gonna build they're gonna close off New York Harbor with the gate. It costs like $70 billion. This is what they do, right? But there are people who are like, we can't do this anymore. And the problem is, every study that they do takes 10 years, and then the reauthorizing study takes 10 years, and if they want to redo it, it takes 10 years, and then it takes another 10 years to get the money from Congress. It takes another 10 years to build it. I mean, after Hurricane Ike in Houston, they came up with this idea, the Ike Dike. It's just like a big wall in front of the Galveston Ship Channel, Ike was in 2008, and they are like maybe going to get started on it soon, and that's like a world record time for them. Like it's unbelievable. I was talking to this person, she's like a lieutenant. They're all like lieutenants for some, like generals. They're not. General, I think her last name was Beagle, the other day, and she was like, she works they have an engineering with nature program. And it's like good. Congress gave them money to try to do this. And she was saying that in San Jose, they wanted to fix flooding on this river, Guadalupe River that goes into San Jose. They wanted to dig a concrete channel, right? This is what they do. But it turned out that the velocity of the water going through the channel was so high that it would have like destroyed like an entire community. So she said, I'm gonna do it differently. And she created this like nature, like sort of this like spillway basically. She said, why don't we reauthorize, it took 5 years to reauthorize the study, blah, blah, blah. Why don't we do this spillway instead? No one ever thought of it. They were like, it won't work. Guess what? Not only does it work, it saved $350 million, okay? So there's definitely some change happening, but it's like trying to turn around that ship that hit the bridge in Baltimore. Like, it's just so big and slow that, yeah, but it's a really good question. And the Democratic, yeah, I'm like, this would have to become like a top issue for voters, right? Like, yeah, no, right? So, but in my cynical opinion, right? So, yeah.
Jake, can I just ask one last question, and then we'll move
Yeah, I
into
know,
our
like the
reception?
food's behind you guys. Like, I'm standing between you and the food.
Yeah. It's a question about language, since you're an English major. I was not, so maybe you can answer this. I'm wondering about the language of climate displacement or climate migration, or in some circles, climate refugees even. And it's kind of related to the question about colonialism. Does this language, does it help us think about, or does it hurt us in thinking about like the historic dimensions and the systemic forces that, one, lead to climate change, but also two, like make people more vulnerable to climate events that cause the displacement? And so I'm just curious if you could comment on the language part of that, if you have any thoughts about it.
Yeah, that's a really good and provocative question. I think it's really well put. I'm not just saying that because you organized the conference, like it really is. Now, like, I did displacement in the book title because I really thought that it was wrong to use the word migration to describe what was in the migrations in the subtitle, because they made me put it there. But like, it's really not right to say it's migration, because it's not intentional. It's usually not like A to B. It's sometimes they come back and leave again, right? So it's like very chaotic. So that's why I chose displacement. Refugee is a really charged word politically, but also like legally. There's UN conventions on this, and refugee is not. There's no such thing as a climate refugee under UN standard, right? So this is like a very difficult one. But I think your other point about like appending climate to it is really, really good. And like there's a fair way to look at a lot of these problems that doesn't have anything to do with carbon emissions and with global temperature increase, right? You could say it's environmental displacement as a result of the way that we choose to manipulate land and water. Climate gets people's attention, but like, climate is like an additional stress put on the environment, and it's like the straw that broke the camel's back for a lot of this stuff. And I think like a sustained investigation of it, you end up not really wanting to emphasize that point. You just want it to be like one of several causes. Yeah, so that's really well put, but it's hard to find a better two-word phrase to.
You get to choose your book title, or?
No, because I couldn't think of one. And so eventually they were just like, it's going to the printer. What do you want to call it? And someone came up with that at the publisher. It's a good title, I think, but yeah. So.
Great. Well, thank you, Jake, for that wonderful, compelling talk. And